Alrighty, folks. Another day, another episode, another weekend, another episode of the Coffee Roaster Warm Up Sessions podcast. And today, we're drinking some more batchy, like always.
Like always.
Like always. We're gonna drink some batch brew as we talk about coffee roasting quality control, or QC, which is a really big thing because, well, one of the biggest things that I think as a roaster now, where I didn't really think about that 5-6 years ago, is how one of the most powerful thing about being like a really solid roaster is having consistency in roasting over a long period of time. So it's easy to get like a one-off banger of a roast or, one bag. But what would happen if you keep buying the same bag, or if you keep cupping week to week production roasts? How are those matching up to say what the coffee tastes optimally at its peak? And that's not easy, but we're gonna roll into that. So that's that. But what do we got brewing up here?
Good old, I think, the bag of Sweet Bloom, the Kenya.
Shoo! Little shout out to Sweet Bloom in Colorado, Denver, I think. Actually, I don't know if I think I have been to their cafe. Yes, I have. No, I went to Huckleberry. I couldn't make it Sweet Bloom. It was across the city. So, which Huckleberry is also in Colorado.
Yeah. Is Corvus, Colorado?
Yeah. Denver is a pretty cool, Denver was one of the few cities that I visited, and I was like, I kind of like it here. I can kind of jive with this. I don't really like the landlocked experience. There's no ocean around you. You're like stuck. Totally. It's a weird feeling. But it's hot.
I like it.
But man,
it's like a little sour for sure.
It's a little sour. It's a little bright.
I don't mind it.
Yeah. It's still so hot, even though it's been sitting out here for a little bit.
On the aromas, it definitely picked up like blackberry. I'm not really getting that in the flavor. It's a little tart.
Tart, yeah.
Man, I hate when that.
Just the wrong pipe. Man, folks, happens to the best of us.
Well, I mean, it's solid. I haven't tasted many Kenyans from this year.
Yeah, I haven't tasted
this
very many
Kenya. This may be my first one. Actually.
Yeah, I think this was my first one as well when I picked up the bag. It has a very classic Kenyan flavor profile. Like, it's tart, really tart, bright, sweet, juicy. I wish I had a little bit more. I think it's because it's just slightly under extracted.
Yeah, for sure.
That has like this sharpness and kind of lacking some of the sweetness.
Totally.
But regardless, I think it's a solid Kenyan.
It's a good Kenyan, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. And we were just, I don't know if we were just talking about this, but I kind of miss our Kenyan from last year.
Oh yeah.
Like, it was a solid coffee. I loved it on batch.
Super juicy coffee.
I think Kenyans on batch slap.
Yeah.
On espresso, they're a little harder to pull, but they can be tasty as well.
But remember when Tim threw the last couple of bags on espresso?
I remember that.
Makeworth, and it slapped. It was super good. I may throw a Kenyan on tomorrow on espresso.
From who?
Kawa.
I'll be there.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. I have way too much good coffee to play with.
Yeah. Yeah, but we actually just got some Kenyan samples from some folks down south in Seattle from Mercanta. We're going to give those hopefully a sample roast here soon and give those a try. I'm not super sold on it, but I'm also open, when coffees take you by surprise. Sometimes we cup coffees and we're like, oh, this was like such a surprise. Like the Burundi, actually. Exactly. It was like, I wasn't at all even thinking about serving a Burundi. And then that one came up, and like 2 or 3 times on the cupping table, we're like, okay.
Yeah, and actually we just cupped it, and I thought it was one of my favorite coffees on the table.
Yeah,
it's solid.
Against coffees like the Virgil coffees, and so it's
solid.
Yeah, it's always nice to be surprised by coffee. just pleasantly surprised. But yeah. Solid Kenyan, folks. For those of you watching this on YouTube, maybe you watching this on Spotify. I know some of you have been watching this on Spotify, which is great. Drop a comment on YouTube. Let us know, have you had any tasty Kenyans? Who should we buy Kenyan from, coffee roaster wise? We're always open to trying new roasters. So yeah, throw that down there.
Super good.
But that being said, roasting Kenyans are hard.
It really is.
I don't know who was like, man, who was it that, we were at the wedding and somebody was like, oh yeah, we just got our new Kenyan and it's our first time roasting a Kenyan. And I'm like, all right, good luck.
Was that Chris?
No. I don't know. No.
Else.
It was, and I was like, good luck roasting that. It's it gave us a run for our money when we had it, but the payoff once you nail it down is very very high. It's like high risk, high reward sort of thing. But
we also learned a lot from roasting that coffee.
It was a
we had
huge
to
learning
take a unique
experience,
approach.
actually.
Yeah,
A super huge learning experience. And actually, it was also a coffee that, like, it was tasty. I really enjoyed it all the way through its shelf life, which we'll talk about here soon. But it also didn't come out roasting the way, according to our roast system, so to speak, of how we roast coffees. It didn't actually match up to that because Kenyans are really difficult to roast in how they crash, how they react to first crack, and all that stuff. It was challenging, but like a super good learning experience. And once again, I enjoyed it at the end of the day. So, sure. But yeah, so roasting quality control, I think this is just going to be like a great conversation to have because I think it's also really challenging. Like I said, to start off with, like, you can have one really great roast of a coffee, but the challenge there is how do you maintain roasts over a long period of time at peak quality, and not just at peak quality, but but as the coffee ages and really as the coffee ages, how do you maintain that quality as the green bean is actually changing? And like in Washington, how do you maintain that kind of quality when, you know, literally 1 month we were having 60s weather, all of a sudden in a month you have, you know, temps in the high 70s, mid 80s, you know, that affects, especially if you don't have like a super climate controlled either storage or roastery, that gets really complicated and actually impacts how you roast coffee.
Yeah, I mean, quality control always starts with the green coffee from the very beginning. So maintaining good green and proper conditions like you're describing is like ultimately key, because that's one factor that you have to kind of outrule or remove, so that way when you're roasting, you're actually focusing on the roasting process and not having to worry about what's happening to the green. So if you can control the green accurately and properly, then everything else can be much easier, and you'll have a better starting point in actually developing your roasting profile or your roasting style for the specific coffee. So green coffee is like ultimately one of the most important things. And I was talking to another roaster here locally, I'm not going to name drop, but he's a big deal. And he was saying that's one of the most rated and least talked about topics is green coffee storage for most roasting companies. So.
Yeah, you won't really find that really talked about very much anywhere across the board, even though that's honestly the reason why, you know, us roasters prefer fresh crop over, you know, 1 year old crop, 1 year plus 2 years, is because green coffee fades. Like, it's a very big difference. I mean, even we've had coffees where at the beginning they were bonkers sweet and amazing. And then like the last couple weeks of our inventory, it's like, you're like, okay, you know, no matter what you're doing, you can't really adjust the roast to bring that out all over because the green just ages. And that's that's just the reality of it. And that's like a whole conversation of its own once again. But the difficulty there is like different processing methods will age differently. You have to keep control of moisture content, water activity. It's like a lot of those things are just like really difficult to manage. And storage has a big part to do with that. And so something that we've actually resorted to with the help of some coffee professionals in the industry is right now our game plan is we store the bulk of our coffee in somewhat of a colder, try to keep it as on the colder side, temperature ambient, and then we actually move it to like a seasoning environment,
prep room,
which is then at room temperature. So it's prepped to go into the roastery. So when we're dropping coffees in the roaster, we're trying to keep that the same from day to day to day to day, from roast to roast. And one of those things that we do is we actually literally prep the coffee in a stabilized climate room, which helps a lot.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, that, I mean, I don't want to stick around on that same concept because we have so much to talk about.
Yeah.
But I think that was one of the most impactful things that we learned, especially within the last year or more than a year now.
Yeah.
That phone call with Scott when he was just like, you know what? I think this tastes great. Your curves look great. Like everything looks great. But he's like, my hunch is this. You should try this. And then when we tried that, we ourselves tasted the coffee and we're like, whoa, that made such a big difference. And that had nothing to do with our roast specs, had nothing to do with our curve.
That's insane.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, like the points on the coffee went up by like a point or two.
At least a point.
Yeah.
It was like 1.2 or something like that. Yeah.
And that's insane to think that like you can get a whole point in just how you manage your green before it hits the roaster.
Right.
But other than green coffee storage, the second thing, one of our biggest things is making sure, well, along with green storage, you're trying to maintain as much data, as much equilibrium, like trying to make sure things are the same. With roast, you're trying to do the same exact thing. The biggest thing that we've been kind of keeping track of is data. Data is huge. So for us, that means, keeping control of data, whether that's outdoor temperature during the roast, the indoor temperature of the roastery, and then also keeping in mind, using Cropster to track all of our roasts, all of our data. So roast time, roast profile, ROR, bean temp, turnaround charge, all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest things that we use is Cropster. And I know there are cheaper software platforms to use, but when you pay for a software that has constant modifications and updates rolling it on, that where their Cropster's pushing the boundaries of what roasting software can do, it's so valuable and important.
Yeah, 100%. I've used Artisan before. Like I've roasted with Artisan.
That's right.
So I know how to use both. And like with Artisan, you can export those curves, you can print them, you can have a hard copy. You can, lay them out on the table and compare them physically. But the beauty of Cropster is that you can actually take all of that information that happened during a roast and then compare all of it into like one view. So therefore you have so much information and you can track that consistency roast to roast. And you can also have those cupping notes in there that kind of tell you what happened when you tweaked roasts. Mm-hmm. That's like crucial. You can add, Agtron or Roast Vision or Espresso Vision numbers that gives you information to now track. It just, when it's all compiled into one, it just minimizes so much work. On top of that, it's helping us maintain all of our green inventory. Yeah. And we know like what's happening. Is this a repeat coffee? And then when, especially with some of our coffees, like Jorge Mendez's coffees, we are getting them back like every year. When we get a new crop, we have all the history saved. Yeah. And I think that just makes life so much easier. It's all saved on the web. Yeah. It's perfect.
Yeah. And all the notes that you can add to each curve, to each profile, their cupping platform that they're like cupping app, which we haven't used or kind of used, kind of dabbled, which is really cool that at least you have the feature of being able to cup and then in real time add notes, not in a notebook somewhere, not on something, but you add notes right in Cropster. Yeah. And then it's so helpful when you go back to roast and you're like, oh man, this is what we are tasting on this roast. How can we adjust the profile? with these notes right in Cropster in real time and be able to adjust them right in the same day. It's all in one space. So this isn't an ad for Cropster, and it might sound like one, but man, it's been such a helpful resource for us. And it's just really solid. And for roasting and QCing and all that, maintaining quality, it's a must. Like I see these things as you just can't skimp out on some of these things, because it's really the biggest thing that can help improve your roasting, really.
Right.
So
yeah, I agree. Apart from like sensory and keeping track, you can keep that, like you said, in a journal. One of the most important things is that information and how you interpret it.
For sure.
Yeah. So I'm not going to repeat what I just said, but at the end of the day, data logging is absolutely crucial for all of the things that we were just talking about, repeatability, and then making proper adjustments to tweak roasts as your green coffee ages. Because the curve may look the same throughout the whole history of the green coffee, but as you're tasting differences, you're going to have a little tweaks here and there just to make the coffee stay consistent.
For sure. So maybe because you mentioned green coffee aging over time, what's been our experience and what's been your experience with tasting coffees as they age and being able to adjust accordingly? What's that process look like?
Well, again, every coffee is different. Yeah. So it's not like an answer that will fit everything. But
I guess to interrupt you, I guess, like, how do you spot those differences? What's that process look like? What are you looking out for? And when do you know when to start adjusting things?
Well, but like I said earlier, so if we control all the elements of green coffee in the beginning, so we maintain that same temp when the coffee goes in, the green coffee, we maintain the conditions, we keep those things as a static, then when we're roasting, next thing is we're adjusting our curve and our roasting profile, and then from there we're cupping, right? So once you cup and you're tasting something different, you take steps back. So you build up to the cupping, and then when you taste something, you're like, that did not taste the same according to my notes when we just got the coffee. Or sometimes you and I even take it back to our to when we get our pre-ship or ship samples. We're like, oh, it's even changed from that. That's already like a little highlight saying, okay, what do we need to look at? So then we look at the curve. What has changed is like our weather conditions, literally the season, the climate in the roastery has changed. Okay, maybe not. How do we manage that?
Yes.
How do we need to tweak the curve, tweak the roast profile and keeping the curve the same? And then, okay, we cup that next time, let's say, or we roast it, make some changes. It's still not like exactly where we're at. Then we're investigating the green and saying, what needs to be done to the green? Is this just the green aging? And then once we evaluate that, then we step back into the roast profile and say, okay, we know the green has already lost maybe some of those, very tender, like volatile flavors. Like, okay, how do we make this coffee good? Probably not as good as it was when it was fresh, but we still want to maintain the quality. Right. So how can we adjust the roast profile to maybe tweak a few different things so it still tastes good, not the same, but good.
Right. And that's like a really important thing, is to keep cupping on a regular basis and keep taking notes. Our cupping process, what I've really enjoyed actually, is cupping roasts blindly.
Right.
And we know our coffee like very well. Yeah. Like you can pick out, okay, this is this. After you're literally cupping week to week, you're gonna know which coffees are which. But the blind cupping helps because there could be two different roasts of the same coffee, and being able to compare and contrast. And then with the notes that you're taking, you can also look back on, okay, what was I tasting of this coffee at this date, at this roast number, and see, does that match up with what I'm tasting right now 3-4 months later?
Yeah.
And that's a really big deal. Yeah. And that, as you know, whether you're a new roaster or you've been roasting for quite a bit, which I'm sure you probably already do, but cupping coffees on a regular basis, I know it's the same thing. I know it could get boring, but it's so essential. That's so important, especially when we're talking about green that's changing over time.
Yeah.
Because you need to be able to notice some of those changes, or else you might think it tastes one way, but it hasn't tasted that way the last 4 weeks that you've roasted it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so that note taking, the recording, the documenting is super important. And then being able to, just ask yourself, like, what can we do in the roast profile to at least get it a little better? And that's something that you kind of always have to be evaluating on a regular basis. That's just the nature of the game. And that actually makes things kind of complicated because, well, you're you have to always be adjusting and keeping an eye out. Man, this tasted this way on pour over. For some reason, it doesn't taste as sweet as I remember it, and all that jazz.
Yeah. One idea just pops into my mind as we're talking about this is, what if we took our first initial dialed in profile, took some of that coffee, vacuum sealed it and froze it, and then cupped it 3 months later. I think we may need to implement something like that, because that would be super fun. You can compare, as long as you freeze it, everything is done properly.
Yeah.
You can compare that initial dial in to the tweaked and modified future profile. I think you could create some data over the course of years. You could start creating data and and look for patterns. The key is when you have so much data, you can look and just basically spot different patterns. Then your ability to predict what's going to happen as green degrades and then as flavor changes, and then you can tweak your profiles according to that pattern that you've noticed. But if you're not keeping data, good luck finding a pattern,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so, I think that's, the bulk of, QCing is making sure you're cupping regularly, but we're also brewing these coffees regularly.
Yes.
We're brewing them on batch brew. We're brewing them on pour over, V60. I don't know. What do you brew with at home? You brew with
most
all
days.
kinds of things.
I just do 3 different, and one day I can literally brew it 3 different times.
Yeah.
The new coffee that we're hoping to release soon. The last time I brewed it was a few days ago, I think on a Monday, and I brewed it on batch brew first thing in the morning. Checked it. What's happening there. Then I brewed it on V60. Then I brewed it on the Stag X.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll throw in the Tricholate there,
Yeah.
So I brew it a lot. That's on top of cupping.
Yeah,
I'm so familiar with these coffees. I think we cup at least once a week, and I think this week we've cupped twice.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like we're cupping a lot.
Yeah. And we've also been pulling all of our coffees on espresso. So just making sure it's tasting nicely on espresso, and that also helps us, be able to suggest the right coffees for the right people reaching out. Hey, I need a coffee on espresso. Hey, I need a coffee for just filter. Those different needs, and being able to know where your coffee is and at what stage is just so important. And even though you might have heard right now, like constantly just us saying, keep track of recording things and keeping track of things, that's just such a big part of it. And especially with something like a bean that's just always evolving, that just won't taste the same as it did 6 months ago, 7 months ago, is huge. It's important. And
especially if you're starting out with a roasting company and you're like, well, I don't have much things to keep track of. It's just these things. Sweet. That's awesome. Keep track of the little information you have. Because like you and I know, is the more you get invested, the more things that are happening, the more information you have to keep track of. Like we literally just had our monthly meeting where we put in new practices and saying, okay, we're going to actually keep track of things like this now. Before we didn't need to do that. Before we were kind of in an area where we didn't need that much information.
Yeah.
But now we've noticed that if we don't keep that information, we're going to lose track of our progress.
Yes.
So we need to keep that information.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because this is like an evolving thing.
Yeah.
Like what you might be having, 2 weeks ago, what might be working, you might actually need to double down on more standards. And it's really just to be able to, like for us, we're a small team. It's just the 2 of us, but we need to stay calibrated. We need to stay on the same page of things, and making sure we're speaking the same things and we're thinking the same things in the same direction. That is extremely helpful when you're QCing. Like that's just a big part of it. And so I'm glad you brought that up. And so we're always changing what we're looking out for. We have an entire Excel sheet that has data from, our dialed in reference roasts that keep track of just, all the data that we have from these curves. And also, which we didn't talk about, which maybe we'll just wrap up here soon, is the Espresso Vision color meter. Yes. The Espresso Vision color meter is probably one of the most important things that we've implemented over the last year and a half or whatever into our roasting QCing. And the Espresso Vision meter is really just a color meter that reads the color of, how dark or how light your roast is. And that's huge. And then we also type that into our curves on Cropster, and we can have a solid number to the color that we want. So, hey, this is tasting off. We can just go back to the meter. Right. Oh man, this is tasting a little darker. Or sometimes we roast a coffee and we're like, it's kind of there. And then we look at the meter and it's like, oh, we actually have room to go darker.
Yeah.
And that's huge. So having external tools like this can play a big role in QC.
Yeah. And then final little thing. I know you said final, but I'm going to say final.
Final.
Yeah. Is drink other roasting companies' coffees.
Oh, come on.
That's a big one.
That's huge. That's why we do this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, just go buy a bag. A lot of the times, a lot of roasting companies buy similar coffees. If the coffee is from Elias and Shady Bader and it's the same or similar lot, buy and compare, and then keep notes of that as well and be like, oh, I like this roast version of the same coffee, or I didn't, and why not, and how could you tweak things? Yes. It just gives you another set of another reference point to be able to make decisions.
And put it blindly on a cupping table with with all of your other coffees, so you don't know where it is on the table, and be able to compare and to contrast and take notes. That's a huge win, because it's easy to get your head stuck in the clouds or stuck in your own echo chamber and think, oh yeah, my coffees are great, they're tasting at their peak. And then it doesn't even have to be the same coffee, but you taste another coffee and you're like, ooh, I like what they did there. And be able to ask yourself, what are they doing? And you may not know exactly, but even just thinking like what could be the possibilities is huge. I can't believe, I'm glad we saved the best for last. That's it.
Killer.
That's it, folks. Well, thank you so much, folks, for tuning into this episode. Hopefully you got something out of it. Drop your comments below on YouTube. Send us a DM, send us an email, whatever it is. Give us your thoughts. Do you do any quality control in your coffee? What does that look like? We'd love to know. But anyways, folks, thank you so much for listening. And once again, as always, remember, reflect what's good. Dude, 10 seconds to spare.